Do you obey the law of the land even when it seems unfair? That's what left-wing supporters of Brazil's most popular politician are asking themselves ahead of next month's presidential election. The Electoral Court has barred Inácio Lula da Silva from running from jail, where the veteran trade unionist and former head of state is now serving a 12-year sentence for corruption. Does his Workers' Party move on and throw its support behind his number two, Fernando Haddad, or fight for Lula until the bitter end? Brazil's judiciary has not been spared, as all of the country's institutions and all the main political parties have been rocked to the core by scandals. So who now to govern Brazil, a nation in need of leadership as it battles recession and also a credibility problem? Will disillusion power the far right to office or signal the return of the military into politics? And is there a link between Brazil's instability and the crises engulfing neighbors like Argentina and Venezuela? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what could be Lula's last stand. Joining us is Diego Scardone from Rio, political advisor to the Workers' Party leader in the Brazilian Senate, Lindbergh Farias. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Joining us from Sao Paulo, journalist Brian Meir, the editor of Brazil Wire. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
From the capital of Brasilia, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, who teaches at Northwest University's Kellogg School of Business. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Francois. Thank you for having me on.
And here in the studio with us, university lecturer Glauber Sarrazino, member of the Other Brazil, an association that calls for the liberation of Lula.
Yes, we can say it like that, but it's more complicated than that.
More complicated. Well, you'll explain it to us.
Yes, of course.
Okay. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Now, before we talk about the Brazil's left, let's talk about the latest news. Candidates for next month's presidential election have been reacting to the fire that's gutted Rio de Janeiro's 200-year-old National Museum. One candidate calling the loss of priceless artifacts, quote, a lobotomization of Brazilian culture. The National Development Bank had just signed a sponsorship contract to pay for renovations which had yet to start. Politicians have been trading accusations over the fact that there were slack standards for the building. The current culture minister admitting it's, quote, a tragedy that could have been avoided. And now there have been protests as the building still smolders. Correspondent Catherine Osborne spoke to us earlier from outside the National Museum.
For hours, demonstrators have been gathered outside Brazil's National Museum while authorities are inside trying to understand exactly the extent of the damage and also understand how this could have begun. The fire began on Sunday after the museum had closed, and it blazed for several hours, for around 6 hours before it was finally contained. Demonstrators are angry because it appears that the scale of this tragedy was associated with a lack of maintenance funding for the museum. The federal government had been due to pay a relatively small amount, a little over 100,000 euros each year to keep it up, but since 2014 had not been paying that full amount. An amount for fire maintenance had recently been approved but not been paid. And furthermore, the two fire hydrants in the area, which are the responsibility of the state government, weren't working last night when firefighters arrived. So that's caused some of the anger and the polarization over this issue. And that's why people are watching it closely. Local media is covering it heavily. On social media, images of the museum in flames have been circulating all night last night and all day today on Monday.
Glauber Sarrazino, your reaction to that fire?
That is the tragedy is a kind of metaphor of what's happened in Brazil since 2016. We have budget cuts all the time, and the strategic budget cuts in this kind of sense. The Ministry of Culture, it's almost dead. The Ministry of Education is almost dead. So this is actually the result of this kind of politics.
You say since 2016. Our correspondent says that the proper funds hadn't been allocated since 2014.
Yeah,
so
2014.
It's happened on the left and the right's watch that this building was not maintained properly.
It happens since the turn of Dilma, tried to turn a little bit to the right and apply the neoliberal politics at the end of her turn. So it's not for me. It's not a shock that this has happened, and also what's happened in the state of Rio with the fire hydrant that don't work near the university, near the museum, is also the consequence of this kind of politics in the state of Rio de Janeiro.
Diego Scardone, you're in Rio. What's your reaction to this tragedy?
Well, firstly, it's an extremely sad day for Brazilian culture and indeed for Latin American culture as well. This was the 5th largest natural history museum in the world and the largest in Latin America. During Lula's government, we perceived an increase of 980% in the budget for museums. It's true that during the second Dilma government, there was a high cut in the budget, but it doesn't get close to the cuts that the current government, the Temer government, employed. For you to understand, only in this year, we had only 15 million reais going towards the Ministry for Culture. During the last year of Dilma Rousseff's government, this number was 250 reais. This is the figure only until April. But indeed, if you take into consideration the rest of the year, the amount of money is not sufficient.
Is it the fault of a political party or simply the fact that, well, when Brazil's boom years were happening, when exports were soaring, there was money to go around for something like this, and now that it's lean times, longest recession since in decades that took place, the money's just not there?
The money was invested during the first 2 governments of Lula and the first government of Dilma. Indeed, there was a recession, and that was a clear product of that. But what we perceive in Brazil now is that we have permanent austerity policy brought by this government through the amendment number 95 that freezes investment in Brazil for 20 years. Regardless of which government is elected and which priorities that government establishes as something important.
Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, you agree?
No, not really. And I think that the last 2 statements are in some ways emblematic of a larger issue in Brazil, which is this idea of focusing on finding a way to blame your perceived enemies rather than actually acknowledging that there are externalities that affect Brazil as they would affect any other country. Until you mentioned it, nobody had brought up the fact that commodity prices, and Brazil is relatively diversified for a Latin American economy, but is still very dependent on commodity prices. They crashed. And it wasn't that Dilma Rousseff woke up one morning and decided, you know what, I feel like being neoliberal today. It was something that was basically created by an outside event. And before that, Brazil had already been entering recession. And had been underperforming relative not only other BRIC economies, but even other Latin American economies, in part because a lot of the more hands-on policymaking, this idea of preferring national champions through selective taxation, through selective interest rates in the Bande system, these all lent themselves to a market that was not particularly excited to put money into Brazil the way they had, and having to recover that faith from the market so they can start allocating money and recover some of that success that they previously only had during booms, whether they be coffee booms before oil was discovered or oil booms now. That's something that requires a normalization and a breaking of the cycle, and that requires tough choices and austerity. What happened at the museum is a terrible tragedy, but rather than focusing on what party to blame or otherwise, the impulse should be to make sure it doesn't happen again. This is not the first museum that has burned down in Brazil. In fact, many museums have burned down in Brazil, and some of them quite large. In Sao Paulo, a few years ago, there was a big fire. In the 20s, a major museum burned down. This is something that has happened before, and until, rather than placing blame, policymakers focus on avoiding future catastrophes, things like this can keep on happening.
Brian Meir, your thoughts?
Well, I think that the idea that Brazil ran out of money is a myth being perpetrated by monetarist economists and their lackeys in the bourgeois media and academia. Brazil still has one of the largest foreign reserves in dollars in the world. It has over $300 billion in foreign reserves. The United States government owes Brazil over $200 billion, okay? So the idea that it ran out of money is wrong. Well, it's true that it was hit by a recession. Much of this recession was exacerbated by economic warfare against the economy committed by Judge Sergio Moro during the Lava Jato investigation, when he froze the operations of the 5 largest construction companies in Brazil in 2015, instead of treating them as too big to fail, as Germany did with Siemens, as the US did with Goldman Sachs in similar corruption scandals. That, according to a study that was cited in the BBC, exacerbated the recession in 2015 by 2.3%. Now, the amount of money going towards scientific research is tiny compared to the greater scheme of things in Brazil's economy, right? I mean, we're talking about a tiny amount of money that was going to the museum that was cut 6 times over between 2017 and this year. The amount that the government spent last year on the museum was over 6 times the amount that it spent this year. So I think it's really a misnomer to try and blame this tiny amount of money that was butchered from the museum on greater macroeconomic phenomenon when the president increased
But there's a big fail on all sides. Hang on, Brian. There's a big fail on both sides, and Glauber highlighted it himself. When the fire hydrants don't work, and that is a failure on both left and the right.
Let me ask you something. The fire departments, are they run by the federal government? No, they're run by the state government. The Rio de Janeiro state government is bankrupt, right? But it's the same political party running Rio de Janeiro that's running the country right now. The PT party has never run the government in Rio de Janeiro. It's never controlled the fire department or the fire hydrants. So I think it's very important to establish blame properly instead of depoliticizing the issue and pretending that it's just a general thing related to a commodities failure. You know, the president cut money for domestic violence from like 42 million reais to like 12 million reais because he said we're in recession, we don't have money for this. But he raised judicial salaries by 54 billion, and he's raising them again right now, very conveniently, because they always side with him in all these important decisions, like locking Lula up.
Daniel Landsberg?
So I'm not really sure where to begin there. There was a lot. Where I would say we have to focus on in looking at these sorts of issues is the fact that, yes, it is a small amount of money that goes towards museums, that goes towards science, as the last speaker pointed out. But Brazil is a country that has won, I believe, 4 World Cups, and either, depending on how you gauge it, either 0 or 1 Nobel Prizes, despite being a huge country. That's not something that a lot of money is generally allocated to by either party, by either the left or the right. Where a lot of money is allocated is in social services. It's in allowing people to retire early. It's in providing quite a robust health system, a robust banking system for poorer citizens, all of which are very positive goals and which created a middle class, which was a real boom for Brazil's economy for many years. The issue is that is dependent on the amount of money that the government has to spend. Does Brazil have reserves? Yes, it has quite large reserves. It has a lot of people. It's a big country, but it has very large reserves for the region, at least. That said, when you start living off of your reserves, rather than trying to fix your economy, that creates a cycle that, speaking as a Venezuelan, ends badly. When you start using your reserves, rather than finding ways to incentivize new money coming in, that ends in disaster. The government, and I have a lot of qualms about Temer's government, and I think that the corruption, which we're discussing today, is something that is very, very strongly rooted within all the political parties and is really something systemic. That said, the idea that you don't have to cut spending across the board when you're facing a fiscal cliff to the point that Brazil is, when you're taking in much less money than you require to make your usual expenditures, that's not a sustainable system. And basically, Lula, who was very popular, and Dilma, who was somewhat popular during the first 4 years and fell after the money ran out, they got to live essentially what was the party. And Temer, for all his flaws, has been stuck trying to get Brazil through the largest hangover it has had in its modern history. And that requires hard choices. And unless one has a crystal ball to know whether the fire department is the one thing that you shouldn't cut money to at the regional level, there's going to be cuts across the board. And cuts do create heightened risks of natural calamities occurring.
Glauber Serrazino?
This kind of economics that you speak is not a political one, because you can cut everything like everything is the same. One thing is the fire department, another thing is science and technology and research, and another thing is the interest of the public death. So there is a real politic choice to do.
There's arbitration.
Of course, there is arbitration. You can cut like said, 34 million, 15 million from the violence program, or from the programs like Bolsa Familia, or from science and technology, or from the university, and keep I don't know how many billions to pay the interest of the debt. So sorry, there is money. There is also a political choice that some kind of money we keep and we share, and other kind of money we don't share with certain people. So there is a political choice.
Political choices which citizens will be making in 5 weeks' time at the polls in presidential elections. Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to look at the choices the left faces in Brazil. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We've been talking about the breaking news out of Rio de Janeiro with that 200-year-old National Museum burning down, and how that's impacting the political campaign ahead of the presidential poll next month. For the left, the big issue is what to do about Lula. Last Friday, the Electoral Court, the penultimate jurisdiction possible, ruling that Brazil's former president cannot run from jail where he's been convicted of corruption. And the work week beginning with a scheduled visit by Fernando Haddad, his number 2, to Lula in jail. That decision on Friday, the penultimate recourse. But the PT, the Workers' Party, knows it now. It faces a September 17th deadline to present an eligible candidate for next month's presidential poll.
They did the right thing not to let him be elected, because if a person who's in prison becomes a candidate, it would be a shame for our country, a country that's already a shame for other countries that see what happens with all of the corruption here. So they did the right thing to not let him be elected.
That's one opinion there. Of course, others disagree, and the Workers' Party itself divided over this issue. We're joined, again, if you're just joining us in the France 24 debate, by Glauber Serrazino, who lectures at Paris 13 University, University of Paris, and a member of the Other Brazil. Tell us what the Other Brazil is.
It's an NGO in Paris. We make some translation of information from Brazil to the Francophone public. So we have a festival, a documentary festival. In this time, we have the festival in September 19. So this in a few days.
In a few days, okay.
In a few days.
And here in the French capital.
Here in the French capital, in Paris.
Okay. With us from Sao Paulo is Brian Meir, journalist, editor at Brazil Wire. Welcome back as well to Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, who lectures at Northwestern University and who joins us from Brazil's capital, Brasilia. And in Rio, Diego Scardone, political advisor to Lindbergh Farias, who is the leader of the Workers' Party in the Brazilian Senate. Diego, let's cut to the chase here. What's your religion? At this point in time, should the Workers' Party be throwing its full weight behind the number 2 to Lula, Fernando Haddad, or should they be holding out in the hopes that maybe Lula will be allowed to run?
Well, the stand of the Brazilian Workers' Party is to present all appeals before the courts and to ensure the due legal process. What's happening and what we are witnessing in Brazil is that our judiciary is acting as a political institution. The division of power in Brazil is being eroded. We have judges acting as politicians. They ought to follow the rule of law, our constitution, and other laws, but they're acting as political instruments and political actors. We have around 1,500 other similar cases in Brazil of candidates who ran for elections in the past. So what the Brazilian party is asking is that Lula's rights, political rights, and rights to stand for election are ensured so he can stand for election.
And
Lula
if he can't, what if he can't? What happens then?
Well, we still have a few appeal processes to go through. What the judiciary is afraid is that Lula has 30% of the votes already. He could win on the first round. What happens if he runs, he wins, and later on in the appeal process, he is not guilty? What happens if the Brazilian judiciary tells Lula that he cannot run, and in the future we discover that this was just like a political persecution, as we have been claiming and defending?
So what are you suggesting then? Are you suggesting that the PT not make alternate plans, even as a backup, that they just go forward with Lula as their candidate and that's it, period?
We are just following our legislation. Lula is still our candidate, and we're still going through appeal processes. And until all the appeal processes are saturated, he's our only candidate.
But you have a September 17th deadline under which to name who your candidate is for the party. Otherwise, there won't be anybody from the Workers' Party on the ballot.
As soon as all the appealing procedures are saturated and we have a verdict from them, we will move towards another candidate. But our candidate today is Lula. We are just following our constitution, and we're following the willing of the Brazilian people. We cannot allow our constitution to be destructed by those who ought to defend it.
Glauber Ceresino, if all the appeals are exhausted and they say Lula can't run, what happens then?
I think that is my point of view, but I think the strategy of the PT is also that to put Lula the maximum of time that the party can to I don't know to transfer some kind of votes from Lula to the second one. It's probably Haddad because he's his vice president at the time.
And will it work? He's not very well known.
It worked already because some polls show that at least half of the 39% of Lula goes directly to Haddad. So the other half is it's about TV time in the political program, because Lula, that was a victory in the process, that Lula can appear 25% of the TV time that PT has and in this election. So Lula can be at the electoral program, say, vote for Haddad. That's going to make a big difference.
And last week, Lula got the visit of the former president of the European Parliament, ex-leader of Germany's Social Democrats, Martin Schulz. Schulz had been dispatched to the prison in Curitiba in the southern state of Paraná by the leader of his own SPD party in Germany.
No power in the world can prevent me from saying to a man I have known for many years and whom I trust, I believe you. This is what I told him.
Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, your reaction to that visit by Martin Schulz to Lula?
Lula was a very popular politician, both within Brazil and internationally as well. He built a lot of very strong international bridges with Europe. He strengthened ties with China. He had a bit of an on-off relationship with the United States, but at many times those relations were strengthened as well. He was able to basically make Brazil into an international player on a larger stage than it had been previously. And he cultivated many friendships abroad as a result. The issue that I would have with that logic, though, that by virtue of someone being your friend, by virtue of you liking someone, or even of you objectively thinking somebody would do a better job as president, there is an implication there that also requires that you suspend the fact that a court has found him guilty of corruption. And there's other allegations that haven't even been decided yet. And within Brazil's system, at a time when there has been essentially a corruption scandal that is huge and does have a political undertone to it, absolutely, I agree. But it was not the first. Prior to that, there were huge implications of corruption scandals within the Lula administration, beginning in Mensalão in his first term, that cost him most of his cabinet. And it's understandable to a certain extent within Brazil's system, where you have 40 political parties, some of them very small, and many of the larger ones have absolutely no ideology, such as current President Temer's PMB, and basically just sell their support to the highest bidder. Some of those bids are not going to be above the, are not going to be, let's say, are not going to be what's considered acceptable within Brazilian law. And the laws that allow Lula, or that have allowed other candidates to run from jail, no one has ever won or even really been able to do well in a presidential contest from jail. There have been local politicians for state offices who have won office from jail, but it's not normal by any stretch of the imagination for Brazil. And beyond that, what tightened those laws was Lula himself. These were laws that were tightened on the PT's watch, ostensibly to find a way to minimize the corruption, which is here in Brasilia is ubiquitous. And if you back away from those changes, because at the moment that they become inconvenient, then what is really a rotten system is never going to change. And that costs Brazil and Brazilians victories that have cost them quite a bit. And which they continue to fight. And I think it's short-sighted to view it in such broadly personal terms as, I like Lula, therefore I believe him, therefore he should be able to be president a third time.
Brian Meir, your thoughts on this? Because earlier when we were talking about you mentioned the Operation Car Wash scandal. We remember that there was huge amounts of cash paid out to politicians across the political spectrum. At this point in time, having a campaign for somebody who is behind bars, will it taint Brazil's reputation if he's elected?
I don't think so, because there's a growing international body of very serious people who are not, as was mischaracterized Schultz's comments, making personal comments about their friends. They're basing their analysis on the witch hunt against Lula, which has put him in jail for 12 years for committing indeterminate acts. They could not even clearly define what he did, okay? So there's a growing international
But you will agree that construction firm Odebrecht, for instance, paid millions to both sides.
I'll talk about who's in the movement. Martin Schulz, Bernie Sanders, the AFL-CIO, Angela Davis, Noam Chomsky, a large segment of the British Labour Party, former presidents like Michel Bachelet and Francois Hollande, also Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, have all come out and said Lula's been clearly arrested to keep him from running for office. Why? Because there are two programs for government at stake right now. They're the entreguistas, who are on Temer's side, Geraldo Alckmin, Bolsonaro, who want to continue privatizing all of Brazil's natural resources to the gringos. You talk about Brazil running out of money. Temer gave a $300 billion tax cut to foreign petroleum companies exploiting petroleum in Brazil. And you have this kind of developmentalist tendency of strong public industries, strong public services, and some kinds of checks and balances, according to Keynesian economic principles, to prevent all of the natural resources of Brazil from being sucked out.
Hang on, Brian. You're making it sound like the corruption is only on the right, that all those millions that were paid out by the construction company Odebrecht were not paid to the left as well.
You're mischaracterizing my comments. You mischaracterized the former leader of the German Social Democrat Party, who's a serious person. Now you're trying to mischaracterize what I'm saying. Obviously, there's corruption on all sides. But the ranking of political parties puts PT near 7th or 8th on the list of most corrupt political parties. So it's not all equal. Just as the economic problems are not this one objective thing with only one solution. It's not all an equal situation with equal levels of corruption. As you pointed out, PT did more to fight corruption than any other party in Brazil.
Time is running short, so I want to be able to talk as well about something that you brought up, which is the polling. The one poll last Thursday showed Lula on 39% ahead of his closest rival. It's important to mention who that closest rival is. It's the far right's Jair Bolsonaro. He's a former military officer. And as you can hear here, he's taking, well, a martial approach to governance.
You don't diminish violence with flowers. Let me be clear. Weapons don't generate war, and flowers don't guarantee peace.
So there is this candidate in the wings. Let me ask you, Diego Scardone, we heard Glauber explain how, yes, he believes firmly that those who wanted to vote for Lula will cast a ballot for his number 2. However, could those votes instead go to Bolsonaro at some point?
Bolsonaro's rejection in Brazil, it's the highest. It's around 65%. Our understanding is that Bolsonaro has achieved his ceiling. What that means is that he cannot grow anymore. So we see that by other candidates trying to take a share of his votes, like Alckmin and like our former finance minister as well of Temer's government. They are trying to get votes from Bolsonaro. The poll shows that at least half of the votes of Lula goes straight to his candidate Haddad, who would bring him to the second round of the election. And what we are perceiving in Brazil, as we perceived in Europe and we perceived in a few other countries in the world, is that an increase of the far right, of candidates that have a neutral liberal agenda, that have no commitment with democracy. Bolsonaro yesterday has said that people from the Brazilian Workers' Party should be killed if necessary. So that's what we're perceiving in Brazil. Last week, the Supreme Court delayed one of the cases against Bolsonaro for after the election of racism, for example. So you see how our judiciary system is treating differently candidates and trying to cause interference in our election, because Lula, it's winning the elections.
Winning the elections, there's another factor. I don't know if it's going to play or not, but I'll put the question because we saw here in Europe how the populist wave was stoked by the migrant crisis. Right now, over at the border with Venezuela in Roraima province, refugees have been pouring in. Glauber Sarrazino, could that play in the far right's favor, in Bolsonaro's favor?
That could play a little bit, but I think I think it's the same as my friend who spoke down there, because Bolsonaro, there is a lot of rejection, especially between women. So Bolsonaro is not gonna, I don't know, capitalize among this kind of sense in the border because of the migrants from Venezuela. I don't think so. The one who can make that is Alckmin, if he tried to pick up some of the electors of Bolsonaro. But I don't think it's going to be the real issue in Brazil, because the economic crisis and the social crisis in Brazil is the real issue for the population. That's why people want to vote for Lula. We have Lula, we have 2 ex-ministers from Lula, and a president from the central bank that was also a president from the central bank from Lula. We have 4 candidates that work in the Lula government. So it's the person who calibrates this election is Lula. So I don't think the migration crisis in Roraima could actually play a role in the national context. They could play a role for the state of Roraima and this kind of regions. Yes, there were. But about the justice, is important to say that, because the reason that if we go counter the action from the justice, we're gonna put the corruption in Brazil, we're going to strongest the corruption in Brazil. That is a reason that works if the justice was actually doing her job. But the problem is, with a process with 18 months to condemn Lula, against process with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years to other candidates, we see that the judiciary system is not working like a judiciary system. And the UN told that. The UN said that...
And I'll put it to Daniel Landsberg. First of all, have we, the foreigners looking at this from a distance who don't follow it closely enough, are we overblowing the far right's chances? And number two, this issue of whether or not there will be disillusion at the polls, that we could have surprises?
Yes and no. Essentially, he's absolutely right, or one of the previous speakers is absolutely right, that Bolsonaro has a very sky-high rejection rate from both the center and the left. Lula himself actually competes with Bolsonaro in terms of rejection rate, however. He is by far the most popular. He is also the most rejected. And part of that is a consequence of the fact that he's already been president twice. And he's the person that people are most familiar with and have the strongest opinions about. In a second round scenario, I don't think that Jair Bolsonaro, under most circumstances, would have much of a shot against a moderate like Alckmin. Alckmin is going to have trouble getting to a second round scenario, however, because Brazilians are by and large fed up with a system that they see as corrupt, inefficient, and detrimental to the country's future. And as a result of that, you do have a scenario in which most likely Haddad, because it's very unlikely that Lula will ultimately be allowed to run, comes up against Bolsonaro. And there to the extent that many votes will pass directly from Lula, some of that rejection may pass directly from Lula as well. Because the PT, while Lula is personally popular, the PT is seen by very many people, even erstwhile PT supporters, as unsalvageably corrupt. And in terms of the Venezuela crisis, it is something that very much matters. And one of the reasons that the left, which I think Lula's party would have been probably the best able to capitalize on it because of their strength in the Northeast, were it not for the fact that Lula's government was allied to the Chavez regime, later the Nicolás Maduro regime, that created the crisis that now has refugees flooding by foot among the poorest Venezuelans, not the middle classes, not the wealthy, that were seen as the potential victims by Chavismo. These are people who don't have enough to eat, who are starving, and who have been massacred in Roraima. And nobody's really talking about it because it's election season, and very few politicians see that there's something to gain by doing so. And that is that is definitely, that many deaths is a greater tragedy than any building burning down. But it's harder to politicize, and it will not be discussed. And that's something that is a stain on all sides of the political spectrum in Brazil.
All right, we're going to be talking about it more. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, for joining us from Brasilia. I want to thank as well Diego Scardoni for being with us from Rio, Brian Mir in Sao Paulo, Glauber Serrazino for being with us. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Let me say hello to Emma James, Emma Glauber here present, who visited that museum, maybe, and like all Brazilians, a feeling of sadness. And
yes, it's almost like national mourning, but there's also a very, very large degree of anger about the loss of Brazil's National Museum in that fire overnight. The museum itself turned 200 back in June, so it really is an immensely historic site, and it's very important to many, many people. Now, what's interesting to see is the kind of images that people are sharing online, including this one. It's a Roman fresco from Pompeii that survived the fiery wrath of Vesuvius, but did not survive this particular fire. This person pointing out, survived a volcano but couldn't handle the Brazilian politics. Sad day. Lots of people bringing politics into this issue. More on that in a moment. Worse than natural tragedies is the indifference of human beings in protecting their own heritage. Such disgrace could have been avoided. It's disgusting and sad. Lots of people feeling that basically enough had not been done to protect this site. This woman putting into context really the importance of it. Quai Branly here in Paris has 450,000 objects. The British Museum, 8 million works. The National Museum in Brazil had 20 million objects. It is a huge, huge loss. Now, a lot of people sharing this particular graph, which shows how funding had been cut over the years. In the bottom right-hand corner there, you've got 2018 up until April, where it was only given 11,000 euros. The whole of the year before, 2017, it got 72,000 euros. It's simply not enough for a site of that ilk. A lot of people resharing this article, which was published just 3 months ago, and it talks about, basically it's turned out to be remarkably prescient, talking about the problems of maintenance at the site. 10 of the 30 exhibition halls have been closed. There was a huge fall in visitor numbers, partly, according to this writer, because many people had actually thought that the museum was already shut completely. Now, he spoke to the director, who said there were plans to invest, bring it into the 21st century. He wanted to model it on New York's Natural History Museum, but of course now we know that won't happen. These images from TV Globo really showing the scale of what has been lost and the unlikely nature that much will have survived. There are a few things. A meteor is still in place in amongst the ruins, and apparently there is a collection of invertebrates that escaped the fire because it was in an adjoining building. And this is probably one of the saddest images of the day, really, giving you an insight into the kind of Roman antiquities that would have been inside. A fire officer managing to bring out one of very, very few things that had survived the blaze. And we got quite a heated discussion here about how you prevent something like this from happening. Absolutely, and certainly people are getting very political about it. The president himself, Michel Temer, has spoken of the incalculable loss. Now, others have been a little bit less diplomatic, shall we say. Dilma Rousseff, the former president, has garnered a lot of attention and prompted a lot of anger with her remarks online. She tweeted this, accusing the cut scammers, as she calls them, of freezing investment for 20 years in health, education and culture, compromising the future until the past is turned into ashes. All very poetic, but a lot of people felt she should be shouldering a lot more of the blame herself. People taking to Twitter to say things like this, lying opportunist. And of course the headlines there detailing the kind of cuts that were made under her administration. And this gentleman saying, with all due respect, ex-president, are you not to blame as well? But away from the politics of it, there is a call to action. Students of museology in Rio are calling for people to send in all of the images that they have of the museum, even selfies, so that they can try and collate them and preserve some kind of a memory of that site. Final word on this one. There is a real feeling of loss across the globe on this. The British Library tweeting today, it's a reminder of the fragility and preciousness of our shared global heritage. All right, many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.